the equal knowledge fallacy does the same thing. It assumes that you don't know better, that you don't know any better, that you're reductive, that you're less than, you don't know as much as I do. So I saw this one recently, and I thought it would be an interesting take, passed along to me by another, and a bit more philosophical. We got to get to the philosophical side of this channel. I haven't forgotten that. On something called the fallacy of equal knowledge. And the idea of the fallacy of equal knowledge is if we had the same information, we'd all agree, right? Probably not, is the reality. There are things we ignore, aside from the fallacy of information there. And this happens, and part of the reason I bring this up is this happens sometimes in science too. You end up with the same data, but different explanations for that data because of different thought process going on in a person's head. So I figured this would be an interesting one to have a read through and give some commentary on, but something to think about. And this actually happens at a lot more than just what this speaker is going to be talking about. So I figured it would be interesting. This is Ilana Redstone writing for City Journal. Quote, maybe they're just ignorant. I've lost count of how many times I've heard this hopeful suggestion from students and colleagues trying to navigate ideological divides. It's usually offered as a charitable way of trying to understand why someone doesn't agree with a particular viewpoint on a controversial issue, often one related to identity or equality. This happens with climate change too, or at least it used to. It doesn't happen as much as it did. It doesn't happen now as much as it did before, but it does happen with climate change too. And just in terms of general public stuff, sorry. It implies that the person would agree with the speaker if only they knew better. In some cases, that fact may be the case. That may, in fact, be the case, But its use as a default rationalization has turned it into something I call the fallacy of equal knowledge. It's based on the unstated assumption that if we all had the same information, we'd all agree. Which is not very true. I mean, the logic jump there, and the understanding that we get from communications literature and psychology literature, yeah, you do get that sense that no, we're driven by more than just data and things like that in the psychology literature and what have you. It's actually quite clear on that. We talk about this actually in communications courses, like talked about that with, so Katherine Hayhoe is a good example. Her series Global Weirding here on YouTube talks about this thing has a couple of different videos in the series about communication and what have you, and how you work with people and cross different divides. And what it is you do have to, and what she suggests in talking about climate change is connecting over values first, not on evidence, data, and what have you. And once you connect on values and there's something you share in common, then you can argue other things in data and what have you in good faith. So that's the other aspect there. Let's see. The difficulty of talking across political divides owes much to this assumption. I saw a clear example of it in the fall of 2020 while teaching a course in social problems. It was the semester following a summer of nationwide protests on the issue of race and policing. For weeks, my students and I had been discussing social ills from various perspectives, gradually building up trust. At one point, we found ourselves talking about law enforcement. Given the timing of the course and the events of recent months, the death of George Floyd was on many people's minds. Over the course of our discussion, I asked the class if they thought a reasonable person could view his killing solely through the lens of bad policing, not race. The poll I conducted suggested about 60% said yes, they thought that was possible. I was surprised by their openness to this idea. But as the discussion unfolded, it became clear that several people in that group of 60% had something else in mind. Many assumed that an otherwise reasonable person could only hold this view if they didn't yet understand the reality of racism made it important, even necessary, to see Floyd's death through a racial lens. This point is controversial even within the Black community, but the students assumed that, once informed, such a person would change his mind. It's interesting. So that's an interesting observation that Professor makes now that I think about it, that you can think someone can hold that different viewpoint, but you think that if they knew this, and this, they wouldn't hold that viewpoint. And that's not necessarily true. That's definitely not necessarily true. We're getting to the fallacy part of it here. I ran the poll again. This time I asked, could a reasonable person with the same information you have perceive the killing of George Floyd solely through the lens of bad policing and be unsure about whether it should also be seen through the lens of race? This time, the share of students answering yes dropped to 30%. So, the fact that this drop is here, and a side note tangent, does make me concerned about the K through 12 institution and wokeness going on there because of the racial essentialism that's involved, and that is already seeping in. So they're taught, although this might be a college course, so they might be, teenagers to early 20s. So fresh off of this kind of stuff, and they've been exposed to this much of their lives. So yeah, I could see that there being being the issue. Let's continue. Assuming someone disagrees with a particular political position or claim because they're ignorant is a challenge I can encounter frequently. By way of context, much of my job involves facilitating conversations about topics that make people uncomfortable. The fallacy of equal knowledge tends to emerge among people used to thinking in a specific way about hot-button political topics. When they consider a view that, such as opposition to affirmative action, the idea that gender dysphoric children may be influenced by peers, or even opposition to COVID mandates, they suggest ignorance could explain such thinking. However, when treated as the default supposition, this outlook can stand in the way of constructive engagement. It is grounded in the often false assumption that what divides people on controversial social issues is misinformation. It then creates the idea that those with opposing views, more or better information must be the solution. Indeed, I mean, I did for local supporters, I'm doing a thing on Friday. It's called Philosophical Friday, where I just give you my kind of thoughts on a philosophical thing. And I actually did on Friday a philosophical thought that occurred to me as I was thinking about, faulty assumptions and why you shouldn't make an assumption on certain things, or you shouldn't make an assumption unless you have some way of proving it or justifying excellently that is an assumption beyond a reasonable doubt kind of things. It's a kind of general rule I try to keep. I am certainly not perfect at it. I'm not going to claim that I am. But it's fascinating here because the often false assumption, you can make false assumptions about a lot of things. And one of them is the misinformation thing. And at times people are just reading from two different playbooks and have two different sets of information. That is a very true statement. But at the same time, you can look at the same data and come to two different conclusions. So that's a whole other thing. To be clear, sometimes ignorance is a real obstacle. Recognizing that point doesn't mean believing that all differences on controversial questions can be solved by simply getting everyone on the same page with respect to what they know about the world. No one likes to be treated or condescended to, or as though they simply don't know any better, but the fallacy of equal knowledge does just that. It fails to take opposing values seriously. That's an interesting take. And I suppose in a way the fallacy of equal knowledge is one that I've known for a while, if only just because the way my work life outside of YouTube is that I get involved in doing some of those kinds of things where I realize I can't, I'm going to be working with people of different values. I have to consider their viewpoints seriously. And it's also interesting thinking about it in academia, where a lot of that kind of thing, where the equal knowledge fallacy is in full bore. A lot of times where people just presume, hey, if you had more knowledge, you'd know this. But that's not true. There's a lot of that presumption in some places in academia, just as much as in the real world. Well, actually, no, that was entirely correct. In the real world, there's a lot of the equal knowledge fallacy. There's also a lot of that in academia, but it really is a thing of presuming your opponent is ignorant. You don't consider their viewpoint and their values seriously when you should. And then there's the opposite kind of thing where you might just realize. There is the opposite kind of thing. I'm struggling for how best to say this. There's the opposite kind of thing where you also, you know and understand, and you're not presuming ignorance. Rather, you're listening and you're understanding the values as much as you can. But at the same time, you could agree or you could disagree with those kinds of values. And that's actually a very genuine kind of good faith thing. And then from there, it just, it depends what you would do with it. But that's okay. So yeah, there's the two different things there. Let's like that. Okay. Yeah. And I could see what she's talking about. And, early on in this channel's history, I did the video on elitism versus empathy. And I would actually argue now, thinking about it more, because a lot of elitism is, presuming you're better, presuming you know, presuming all of these other different things. Like, I know best what's for you. Happens a lot with a lot of academics with that kind of elitism, and they forget so much, and it's just like why a whole lot of people don't trust them. Well, I won't say a whole lot of people. Why a significant portion of the population, according to polling, doesn't trust academics has a fair bit to do with that, I would surmise. But I would actually argue this is part of it. Like, with the elitism kind of aspect. I know more than you. Therefore, once I educate you, you will believe as I do. And that's not true. That is such a logical fallacy to presume that would be the case, and borne out in communications literature. Unfortunately, the notion is pervasive. A vast majority of traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion training programs are based on it. One DEI consulting firm states on its website that participants will, on completion of the course, quote, notice how their unconscious biases have been impacting their interactions with others, end quote. This despite research on unconscious bias showing that it does not consistently predict problematic behavior. In fact, because of this inconsistency, the British government phased unconscious bias training out of its programming just over a year ago. I did not know that. That's awesome. I give it to the UK. They figured that out, right? The UK figured it out. Oh, goodness. That's fun. Okay. I did not know. I really honestly did not know that. That's awesome. But the thing here is right. Yeah. Presuming, and admittedly, this is a clip off of here, and honestly, I would want to go read the whole thing from the consulting firm if I had time right now. But notice how their unconscious biases have been impacting their interactions with others. No. Doesn't necessarily do that, and unconscious bias training stuff doesn't necessarily work, as pointed out in literature. Oh, goodness. And it's amazing how the literature gets ignored. It's like, I got a thing I may do it tomorrow for this channel. I may do it, for tomorrow on this channel. I may do the, I got a hold of the AAAS, DEI, or I got a hold of a DEI thing in a AAAS report, and it is quite interesting and something to laugh at. So I may, well, not something to laugh at, but something to consider, or maybe consider and laugh at. Anyway, second, the fallacy of equal knowledge underpins certain curricula on empathy and social emotional learning. One of the biggest firms in the world of SEL tweeted last year, quote, we hold fast to the belief that our work must actively contribute to anti-racism. But the concept of anti-racism is itself infused with particular assumptions about how the world works. For example, that the right way to solve social problems is to see them through the lens of race. And that's interesting. I think now reading that, this is actually the first time I'm reading this article, so I'm not 100%. I thought it was interesting when I glanced at it. Unfortunately, yeah. Yeah, you're making the assumption. That's actually a fair description. Of course, she doesn't go into it because with the wokeness and what have you, but you're making the assumption with anti-racism that everything is racist, that everything has its origins in racism. Like the world is entirely racist and endemically racist and what have you, and it's your job to figure it out and flush it out and get rid of it and dismantle and deconstruct and what have you. That is the very rambling version of the full-on definition. Ultimately, these programs are based on the assumption that, by imparting information about the importance of unconscious bias and the need to adopt an anti-racist stance, previously reluctant people will see the error of their ways. But this commits the fallacy of equal knowledge by assuming that the same information will lead people to the same position on these issues. This fallacy may partially explain why such programming is so fraught. Strong evidence suggests that DEI training doesn't yield positive results and can even be counterproductive and generate resentment. Better options would focus on building a stronger workplace with open communication while respecting a variety of viewpoints. The upshot is missing information isn't always what makes people disagree. When we pretend that it is, we make it even harder to communicate across our political and ideological differences. And that I do agree. Yes, not having enough information can absolutely be a problem. That can be a problem for a whole myriad of things in life, in science, in arguments, and a whole myriad of things. But the But the problem with assuming people are ignorant and assuming people don't know is that, you do belittle their views on something, you do belittle their values. And I think it does, as she describes here, complement the issue of DEI training being counterproductive and generating resentment. And because of the condescension of the equal knowledge fallacy, as I'm going to put it here, that you can end up with the resentment in part because often, and the other video I talked about is diversity training effective, talked about it there. The issue there is that a lot of the diversity trainings, the DEI stuff as they are, tend to caricature people. They tend to reduce people to something less than themselves. If you've seen, like, the Starbucks did it recently, where they had this whole thing where there's all these faceless people. That's what I think of when I think of what DEI training does, in that it removes the humanity from people very easily. And that's one of the things that goes wrong with it. And in a way, the equal knowledge fallacy does the same thing. It assumes that you don't know better, that you don't know any better, that you're reductive, that you're less than, you don't know as much as I do. And so you end up with that kind of problem of condescension, that you are lesser than because you disagree with me, you know less than I do, you are lesser than. You're caricaturing somebody instead of, as Shelby Steele has said in his book, he said it in White Guilt, actually. Shelby Steele said there, you're, instead of engaging with a person's full humanity, you are in a way caricaturing them and reducing them to be less when you apply the fallacy of equal knowledge to presume that, you know what, if they knew as much as I do, they would think the same way. And that is most definitely not true. Prime example of that actually is in the case with climate change. There are a lot of scientists who very much agree that the climate is changing and things are getting warmer, and humans are at least in part responsible for it. There's disagreements on certainly over the alarmism versus not. And most of you who follow this channel know that I am not a fatalistic person with climate change. Just for the record there, you already know that. But the thing about that is there is the assumption that has happened in the past with climate science and climate change that if they used to go off of the equal knowledge principle, that if you knew as much as I did, you'd be all for doing XYZ. But the truth is, we can all know as much data-wise, we can all understand the scientific research and what have you, and what's been done and what we don't know and what we do know and all this kind of stuff at the same level, and very much disagree on we can disagree on certain things, on many things about it. We can disagree on a lot of things with it, and that I'm going to include why in there, as much as some of my. I'm going to include why just for the heck of it. And you can include why, you can include how, you can include what to do, you can include what's appropriate to do, all these different things, and that doesn't make anyone any less human. And I do wonder sometimes if something like that, these kinds of little fallacies and assumptions we make about people, are part of the reason why wokeness has taken off so much as it has, but also some of the reasons why academia isn't trusted anymore and why people are not trusting experts, as it were. That's it. That's kind of my thoughts on the fallacy of equal knowledge. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, comment on the video. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think of the equal knowledge fallacy? And that's it. Until next time. Oh, yeah, don't forget, come on, join us over on Locals. There's going to be more fun things happening. Probably going to add a local Zoom for supporters at some point here soon. But anywhoozle, that's it for now. Until next time, I hope you all stay curious, my friends.